right, Vern, I'm going to invite you on up. There you are. For those who do not know this young lady, she is a child of this church. She was born and raised here. Came to church probably for 9 months before she was born. And up until about 14, 15 years ago, this was her residence and her home church. She is my niece. She's Wayne and Linda's daughter. Where are you at, Linda? Okay, there's Linda and Wayne. I always say that I was very surprised many years ago that Linda went on a mission trip to Guatemala. That was a huge step of faith. When she gave her daughter to missions, that was the greatest step of faith she ever had. And so Linda would be very happy if she could have kept her children like the Waltons, she said one Sunday morning here. But God has chosen to change the world through her children. And so I'm going to invite Veronica. Do you want this or that?
No, I'll use this one.
Okay, very good. Very good.
Yeah, it's on. Okay. Well, thank you, Alan. Good to see you guys. So yeah, I live out in Hawaii, and I'm the social justice director for a church out there. We're called Blue Water Mission. And my big focus of the justice ministry is human trafficking and assisting survivors of human trafficking. And I want to talk a bit today. I titled it Human Trafficking in America and the Call for a Justice Ministry, but really it could be called Human Trafficking and Abuse in America. So I'll share a little bit about my journey. So around 2006, 2007, God started giving me a lot of dreams. I didn't realize that they were God dreams at the time, because what I was seeing every night in my dreams was people being kidnapped and abused and tortured and raped and sometimes killed, and all of this stuff happening in my dreams. And it was never about me. I didn't wake up really afraid. Nobody was after me in the dream. It wasn't like a nightmare, but it was very disturbing. And these dreams went on for 1.5 years, almost 2 years. And I finally went to my pastor and asked him, or just told him, like, hey, I'm concerned because I've been having some really disturbing dreams, and they just keep going. They're not stopping. So he asked me a few questions, and we determined that it probably wasn't spiritual attack because I wasn't waking up in fear, just waking up disturbed. And his response was, well, disturbing and awful things happen in the world, and maybe God is trying to bring your awareness to that. So I went home and I prayed, and I used my journal. That's how I talk to God. So just kind of writing down my questions and asking him, you know, what's going on with these dreams? What are these dreams? And I felt like he said, not one of those audible voice things, but just sort of that, like, this new thought or idea that comes into you, and it's overwhelming, and it moves you, and it just feels heavier and bigger than you. So in that kind of a way, I felt like God spoke to me, and what I felt he said was, this is what happens to my children. And that was very disturbing. It was just like a sobering moment of where I had hoped the things that I saw in my dreams was from my imagination, or maybe it was from watching too many horror movies as a teenager or something like that. But it wasn't. It was what was happening in the world, and God wanted me to know this. So then I asked him, and I should say, how I understood his statement of this is what happens to my children is that we are all God's children, right? Small, adult, children, everything. And then I asked him, okay, so why are you showing me this? Why are you showing me these dreams? Why are you showing me this happening in the world? Because I was seeing it all over the world, and just, you know, all kinds of people that I didn't know in different countries and everywhere. And he said, well, if you didn't know, you wouldn't do anything about it. But now that you know, you'll do something. And so, of course, I got up from that, like, well, I got to do something. So we just started doing things. And a lot of what we did was talking to people. And I started going around and talking to other service organizations in Hawaii, talking to law enforcement and asking, like, hey, what's going on? What's happening? What I realized was that I was having dreams about human trafficking, people being forced to do things against their will. And in talking to law enforcement and talking to social service providers, a lot of times these men, women, and children had nowhere to go or no means to get back to wherever they did have good family. And so what I understood them to say is basically these are like the widows and orphans. Like they could try and come to the police and they could try and testify against the traffickers, against the people who are abusing them, but their only option for where to stay may be in a homeless shelter. And from my dreams, I just thought, like, that's completely unacceptable. I mean, this is a dangerous situation from them, and this just being dropped off at a homeless shelter isn't going to provide the care and the resources that they need. It's not going to provide them with the feeling of security that they're going to be safe. They're not going to feel like that people have their back. So why are they going to put their life on the line to testify against what has happened to them? You know, it didn't speak to the answer that was really needed. So I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do, but God has been speaking to me about this. And if you get somebody who needs help, then call me. I don't know what I'll do with them, but call me and I'll figure it out. Because this is unacceptable. These are the widows and the orphans, and I can't call myself a Christian, and I can't call my community here a Christian church if we're not going to respond to these widows and orphans and this need that you're telling me about. So that's what we did. We were planning a conference, and I was asking a lot of these groups to come and talk at the conference or give us some information that we could share at the conference. I thought, well, if we have this conference, then I will learn what I need to do. We'll just tell a bunch of people and we'll figure it out together and we'll do something and we'll bring in some experts and they can educate us. And I thought, well, that's how I'm going to learn and that's how I'll get started. But God had different plans. 3 days before the conference, I was in a meeting at work and my phone started ringing off the hook. Law enforcement and all kinds of organizations calling me. There was a woman who needed help. And she was scared of the police. She was scared that she would be prosecuted. But basically, she had been brought over. She thought she had a boyfriend. She had some student loans and debt and things from going to college and working and, you know, just trying to live on her own. And she felt like that she was sinking, not getting ahead. And this guy had been dating her for a while, for months, in California, and said, hey, you know, I got a business, I got a house in Hawaii, you gotta come over there, you can make some money, you can pay off your loans and bills and that kind of stuff, and then you can go back. And so she thought, okay, well, that sounds like a good idea. She thought maybe it would be stripping or something, but she thought that she would be able to make her decisions in it. And instead, when she got off the plane, he immediately took her to a store to buy these great big, tall, clear heels, pick up some skimpy dresses, took her to a house. There's a bunch of other women in the house. And he basically says, like, hey, you're going to get dressed, you're going to wear these clothes, and you're going to go out and work the street. And within hours of getting off of the plane, she was out on the streets. And at first, she didn't earn any money for him. She was being stubborn. And then she broke down and she decided to earn some money. She thought that might be safer for her. She got some money from picking up a customer, and she took it to the pimp because pimps require you give them all the money. Women in prostitution don't get to keep any of their money. The pimp keeps it. So he demanded all the money. She gave it to him, and then he beat her because he said it wasn't enough, and it was her fault. If she looked better in the dress that he bought her, then she would have gotten more money. That night, she ran away from that house. And all she had was basically the clothes that she had on and those high heels. And super high heels. I mean, we're talking very high heels. And she walked for miles in the middle of the night, not knowing where she was, not knowing the street names, because everything's in Hawaiian. And she'd only been there for a few days. And she walked and found her way to Waikiki to a pancake house. And then was able to call a friend that she knew on the mainland. And luckily, that friend had just attended a law class and had heard about the issue of human trafficking. And he told her, hey, I don't think you're going to be arrested. I think you can actually call for help. So she at least believed that enough to call some victim of crime hotlines and get some assistance, but she was still too afraid to work with the police. And I was thankful that the police called me. I left work, went over there, picked her up, but nobody had a clue what to do with her. None of the service organizations, none of the police or law enforcement organizations. In fact, they told me, they're like, well, why don't you just drive down to the hotel room and get her bags for her? And I'm like, isn't that the hotel room that the pimp booked? And they're like, yeah, but he's probably not there. You should just try it. And so that's what we did, and luckily he wasn't there. But they had nothing in place to figure out how to help these girls. And so that was kind of my deep dive into the reality of it. So that was our first girl, and then since then we started an outreach team specifically with the goal to go out on the street and meet the women on the street and start building relationship. And if any of them are in a difficult situation, then we can get them out. And we have done some like middle of the night rescue missions off of the street, which are exciting. But overall, I'll just tell you guys, so since then, is 2008 when we took in that first girl, and I just brought her home with us. And Connie was my roommate at the time, and she was gracious, and she just came and stayed with us. But since then, I've personally mentored over 100 women and children, and a few men. Most of them have lived with us at some point along the way. We reach hundreds of individuals on outreach every year. We just one night of the year, if we just did that night for Valentine's Day, we go out and we give out cupcakes and cakes and cards and little Bibles and things that say I love you and speak about the true Father God love on Valentine's Day. And we take these to massage parlors and brothels and things like that. But within like an hour or two, we could probably interact with 100 different individuals and women. Just a little bit about the demographics. So I've worked with, the youngest was 11 years old, all the way up to individuals in their 50s. I've worked with both men, women, girls, and boys, sex trafficking survivors and labor trafficking survivors. Over the years, I haven't been the only one taking individuals into my home. There's been many homes, actually over 20 different families or community houses where single people just get together and live together, and they have an extra couch or they have an extra bedroom, and they'll open it up for at least 2 weeks for a survivor that we've been able to work with. We also started a restaurant because we thought, why not? So the church started a restaurant just to try and give these girls jobs and something that they can put on their resumes. Turns out we don't really know anything about running a restaurant, and we're not that good at it. But we managed to change some lives in the mix of that. We had a woman, she was in her 50s. She had been in prostitution since she was 14 years old, I believe. So looking at like 40 years in prostitution. She'd originally gotten in because her mother had committed suicide when she was a child. She found her mom. And after bouncing around with some family members in some difficult situations, an older man took an interest in her, started taking her out on dates, taking her to dinner, and then turns out he was a pimp and he turned her out on the street. So she worked in New York City for a while. Eventually, as an adult, she got to Hawaii, and she's been there most of her life in Hawaii. But all the education that she had was a middle school education from 40 years ago. And she didn't have a pimp anymore. She didn't have a trafficker because she was old enough. Nobody was really bossing her around. But she didn't know how to get out. Once we opened up the restaurant, she immediately took a job there. She worked there every single night. She was the most dedicated employee. She built relationships with individuals at a church that one of our outreach members attend. And she got to know a person who ran a preschool and a daycare. she was able to transition into that job and working in daycare in the preschool. She started her own house cleaning business on the side. She has her own apartment now. She has her own place that she stays in. She pays for her room. She pays for her food, everything like that, and just loves sending the message back to all the individuals on the street. You can imagine she was quite well known in the scene, and she just keeps sending the message out like, hey, it's never too late to change. And it's possible, and she absolutely loves Jesus, loves God. So I want to share a few pictures of me and some of my beloved girls. I've got their faces covered up just to maintain their privacy and honor that. One of my favorite things to do with them is to get outside. And we go for walks, we go for runs, we join 5Ks, 10Ks, that kind of stuff. Over on the side is a picture of one of our women. She was teaching us how to make homemade pasta sauce, how to make a fresh marinara. I just absolutely love seeing them use their gifts and bless us. They have been an amazing blessing in my life. I have been at the birth or with them for many births of their babies. I didn't think about this when I got into the ministry, but the sex industry results in a lot of babies. And so I've gotten to see so many little babies. I've been in the room for C-sections and regular deliveries and held their babies. Many of them have lived with us. I'm an auntie many times over in Hawaii. So I want to talk a little bit about human trafficking. Did I skip a page? No, I don't know. Guess not. All right, so anyway. Going forward. All right, human trafficking. A little bit of a definition for you guys so you know what I'm talking about. So a lot of times people think that it's like human smuggling, moving people from country to country, and that's not what it's about. It's about traffickers using force, fraud, or coercion to lure victims and force them into labor or commercial sexual exploitation. Okay, so what does that mean? That basically means you work and they get the money. Okay, so the victims don't get any money or either no money at all or hardly any money at all. Labor trafficking victims can be found in restaurants, in farms, on construction sites, factories, but also even in offices. We had a young woman who was trafficked to the U.S. and she was working in an accounting office, but she was working for no pay for 6 months. They told her that the laws were different for foreigners and that they didn't have to pay her minimum wage and that she needed to work, I think she was working 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week for 6 months for no pay. On the sex industry side of things, it can be massage parlors, brothels, strip clubs, pornographic videos or pictures, on the street where they could have the girls working, or it could be in an escort agency. But sex trafficking, I want to highlight, is very, very closely tied to prostitution. I have not met everybody who works in the sex industry in the world, but I can say of all of the individuals that I have met, every one of them have been exploited. At some point, somebody has been at least managing them and taking care of their money, which means keeping their money, and they never got it. So a pimp is really a trafficker. There's not really a difference in reality. Some people were concerned when I started having kids that I should get out of this and that I shouldn't have my children around this crowd of people, around these women, that kind of thing. And I am absolutely proud to raise my kids alongside of their kids. These women have survived amazing things. It's unbelievable what they've survived. They are incredibly strong, and their children are incredibly loving, and I love being with them. I think one of the results of our ministry that I'm incredibly proud of is that a lot of times the women come to us and they may already have children, but they won't necessarily have what do you call it? They won't have responsibility over the children. They will have lost custody of those kids. A lot of times they come to us also pregnant. So they may have already lost custody of some of their kids. They may be coming to us pregnant, getting ready to have another one. And for the ones that lived with us for short periods of time, even if it was only for a month or 2 months or something like that, all of them have regained custody of their children, and they have all maintained custody of the children that they've had since then. One of my favorite stories was when my daughter was about a year old. Now, she was a year old. She was already walking, talking, running, kicking the ball, doing all this stuff, right? And I was trying to tell her to stop doing something while we were in the living room. And she wasn't listening. She was just laughing and doing it anyway, you know, like just giving me that eye and still doing it. I kept telling, no, no, no. And then finally my husband stopped in and picked her up and took her outside of the room for a little time out. An explanation like, no, you need to listen to mommy. Well, we were all in the living room with the girls, and the 2 girls that were there, they had already had children. They didn't have custody of them, and one was pregnant at the time. And they started talking to each other, and I was like, what's going on? What are they so excited about? And then finally, they stopped, and they're like, so, Vern, hey, Vern, so you mean to tell me men are useful for something other than having sex? A completely serious question. And I was like, yeah. He's a father, he's a husband, you know, and they're like, this is amazing. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, why is this coming up? And they're like, well, you were telling Alexis no, and she wasn't listening, and you were starting to get frustrated, but then he stepped in and he took her to the other room. And so you didn't have to lose your patience and start yelling and go completely crazy because she wasn't listening. And I was like, yeah, he's a parent too. Like, yeah, he takes care of her. Like, I wouldn't want to raise a child without a husband. I wouldn't want to even be pregnant without a husband. He has a role, he is useful, and I'm very appreciative of him. But what I realized in that moment was that these girls had never seen the father of their children be a father, right, to their kids. They had never seen their own father act as a parent towards them. And what was even more unbelievable to me, this was the first time they had seen anybody. Like, they had never even been to a friend's house who had a father who behaved as a parent. I didn't even know that this was a teaching moment that we were having there. We were just living life. But they picked up on something and saw, like, this is amazing. And it totally shifted the way that they thought of men. They weren't making a joke. They weren't being sarcastic. They weren't doing any of that. They were serious. This was a completely new idea that a man could be useful and helpful and a part of the family network. So I want to talk today. I'm going to talk a little bit more about human trafficking. I'm going to talk about our problems in society that make trafficking possible in our country, and I'm going to talk about God's call for justice. And then we'll go through a few action points for you guys, because I can tell stories, but I've got to teach something also and feel like you guys have something to take away with you. So we're going to do all that. Before we get into it, I'm going to share some stats and facts and things like that. It's a disturbing and it's a heavy topic. So I want to go through some grounding techniques in case you're feeling overwhelmed by the information that you're hearing. So if you're ever feeling overwhelmed by what you're hearing and what you're experiencing, you want to try and engage your 5 senses. And if you can engage more than one, that is helpful. So there's sight, there's smell, there's hearing, there's taste, there's touch. So sight, noticing what's here in front of you, noticing the colors of the shirts, my shirts, that kind of thing. Noticing the smell of air fresheners, hearing, tuning in, saying like, okay, I can still hear her voice, I can hear, the air conditioners, I can hear people coughing, whatever. Taste, if you've got candy in your pocket, this is probably the only time in life I'll ever tell you to eat candy, but if you got candy in your pocket, that can help you ground to the current moment and not get overwhelmed and feel like your thoughts are flooding away in a stressful situation. And the same thing with touch. So we can all practice a little touch exercise right now. Rub your hands together, your fingertips together. Notice how you can feel that feeling. You can feel your hands and your fingers touching each other. So if you get overwhelmed at any point, just rub your hands together, okay? Okay, so human trafficking. What are traffickers looking for? There are 5 key things that make people vulnerable to trafficking. There's 5 listed here. I'm going to read them off. I want you guys, a few of you, to shout out an idea of what do you think is the biggest factor that I've seen in making people vulnerable. So number 1, psychological or emotional vulnerability. Number 2, economic hardship. Number 3, lack of a social safety net. Number 4, natural disasters. Or number 5, political instability. 1, 2. Good guesses. I heard a 3. The 3 is right. Lack of a social safety net. The failure of relationships around these individuals as children or as young adults is the number 1 thing that I have seen has made them vulnerable. I've had women that came from very well-to-do families, going to the best high school that we have in private school in Hawaii, and they were trafficking victims. I've seen the poorest of the poor, I've seen the very well-off. It's been surprising, but that economic hardship is not as big of a factor as you would think. It makes things more difficult for the parents, but really, this lack of a social safety net, something about those key relationships, those foundational relationships, parental relationships, grandparent relationships, community relationships has failed them, and that is what has made them vulnerable. Abuse destroys our social safety net. That is what has affected most of these women, directly or indirectly. Drugs, alcohol, domestic violence, sexual assault, homelessness, trauma, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning that you're just in a bad situation and it just keeps repeating and repeating every day. That's where it gets complex. So if the parents have any of these issues, the parents are not able to be fully present and take care of themselves and take care of the kids. Therefore, the kids come out with issues and become vulnerable. I think we, as people of God, as a community, as a church, we can be a social safety net, right? We are a community of individuals. We are a community that aims to practice righteousness, to provide a healing environment, to give encouragement and support. We try our best. We're not perfect, we're all sinners, but we're working on healthy relationships and how to interact with each other, how to work through differences, how to work through grace and forgiveness. We are examples of that to the world. And the world looks to the church for that. So I'm going to go through a few of the stats about the problems in our society, and then we're going to talk about the good news, okay? But you're going to hear some bad news first. Okay, so first off, the average age of entry into prostitution in America is between 12 and 14 years old. Now that feels completely unbelievable, but it actually is true, and it begs the question, why are they so vulnerable? How are they getting tied up into this? Well, like I said, abuse. And there's a lot of different types of abuse that make people vulnerable. We've got substance abuse, we've got physical abuse, sexual abuse, but we've also got things like neglect and emotional abuse and spiritual abuse, financial abuse. If a woman is in a domestic violence situation and she's completely dependent on her abuser for financial means, she will see no way out of it for her and her children. So I'm going to go into these a bit more. All right, so rub your hands together if you need, or eat some candy. Substance abuse. 21.5 million Americans aged 12 or over are battling a substance addiction. Have you guys seen drug abuse and alcohol abuse increasing in your community? Everybody has. Over 8 million children live with at least one parent that is an addict. So one or both parents could be addicted. That's a big deal because 1/3 to 2/3 of all child abuse cases are related to alcohol and drugs. Domestic violence. 10 million children are exposed to domestic violence. So they're seeing that in their homes. Every minute, 20 people are victims of intimate partner violence. That's basically another term for domestic violence. So that means by the time I finish this presentation, if it's 30 minutes long, and every minute 20 more people are being abused, that's going to be 600 people before we walk out of here today. Every 98 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. And these are current stats. Every 8 minutes, that victim is a child. That means that for women, 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted. I would argue it's actually higher than that, but we'll go with these stats. So 1 in 4 and 1 in 20 men have been sexually assaulted in their life. Particularly on the male side of things, that's not something that's talked about or disclosed very often at all. That can be very hard for male adults and children to be able to come forward. I want to talk about the difficulty in coming forward. So let's see, I think Alan's going to hit the light here so you can see this chart a bit better. If you look up here, there's basically like little stick figures. So this represents 1,000 perpetrators, 1,000 rapists. And all of this very lightly colored are the ones that never get reported. The reported ones are only up in the corner where it's a little bit darker. And then the next shade darker, you can see that they actually faced a trial. And then in red, you will see 8 little people. Those are the ones that actually go to jail. So the reason why we don't know about the violence happening in our communities a lot of times, we don't see it in the news, is because it's not reported. And if it is reported, if the victim is brave enough to report it, you can see even there, most of them are not taken seriously, and the perpetrators do not face jail time. Okay, we can turn the lights back up. So child victims, I want to point this out. Child victims, you know, I heard about as a kid stranger danger. It's not about strangers. Strangers only account for 7% of child sexual abuse. So 93% of the times, the perpetrator is known to the victim. 59% are acquaintances, and 34% are family members. And that's something that really shocks people. They don't think that familial sexual abuse, incestual abuse, is really happening, but it is. I hear those stories from women that I know, inside and outside of my trafficking ministry. It happens. And it happens at the home. 55% is at or near the victim's home. 12% is at or near a relative's home. And 8% is on school property. 15% is an open public place like a bus, and 10% is an enclosed public area such as a parking lot or a garage. So kids that have been abused, domestic violence, they're seeing that in their home, sexual abuse in their home, drug and alcohol abuse in their home, right? If the home is not safe, 55% of just sexual assault is occurring at home, and then another 12% at or near a relative's home, they're going to run away. They're not going to want to stay there. If they know they're getting abused tonight, why not take their chances and going somewhere else? Maybe they won't get abused. And that's how we end up with 1.7 to 2.8 million runaways in America at any given time. In Hawaii alone, we see 300 runaways per month. Dallas did a study because they also see around 300 runaways per month, and they wanted to find out how quickly or how endangered are the runaways of being picked up by a pimp or a trafficker. Anybody want to take a guess how much time it takes before a runaway is approached by a pimp or a trafficker?
6 hours.
6 hours? Oh, that's not quite 6.
Maybe when they show up at a bus station.
Bus stations? Yeah, those are certainly places where the traffickers are looking for them. Their conservative estimate was 24 hours that a runaway would be approached by a pimp or a trafficker. If their first stop is at the bus station in the middle of the night, it's only going to be a few hours. Now here, you're probably not going to see children or young adults approach that quickly because we're in more of a rural area, but do not think that they are not being approached, that you do not have pimps or traffickers around here, that they are not in danger or that they can't get to danger very quickly. Just because we're in a rural area does not mean that this isn't happening. So all of these stats, they feel horrible and it makes us feel like that we're doomed, but we're not really. It's actually getting a little bit better. Sexual violence has fallen by 50% in the last 20 years. So it was worse before, it just wasn't talked about. So you're seeing more awareness and more talk and more help and support for domestic violence, for sexual violence, for trafficking. All of these things have improved. So we can't blame it on the younger generations. It's not just that. It's actually been going on in history. It's been as rampant in history as it has been today. And you can see that in the Bible. A lot of times we don't focus on these stories, or we miss those parts. Like, I don't know what that meant. But just to highlight a few, I mean, Abraham, when he got to Egypt, he was afraid. Do you guys remember? He offered up his wife, Sarah. He was basically pimping out his wife to the Egyptians, so he didn't get hurt himself. Sarah, in turn, she almost killed her maidservant and her child, right? She sent them off into the desert to die. David, great man of God, but he was a murderer and he committed adultery. But what we often forget about is that he failed to protect his own daughter from ancestral abuse. His own daughter was raped by his son, and he participated in a conspiracy to cover it up with silence. He encouraged her to be quiet and not talk about it. Lot, he was one of the few, right, that he got out of Sodom and Gomorrah, but he offered up his own daughters to be gang raped by the angry gang outside. Judah, the father of the greatest tribes of Israel, he tried to have his own daughter-in-law burned to death because he impregnated her and he wanted to cover up his crime. Monotheistic Israelite priests, they used their religious power to sexually prey on women serving in the tabernacle. That's talked about in 1 Samuel. And priests and other religious leaders used their power to physically exploit the vulnerable, especially widows and orphans. And that was talked about in Micah and in Malachi. So sometimes we feel like, oh, everything's gotten worse. It's these crazy generations, you know, like they lost their way, that kind of thing. But no, it's been around forever. And it takes good people to notice what's going on and stand up against it and make a difference. So what are we to do? Well, I think that we all have something to do, and that God has a call for us for justice. There is over 2,000 verses in the Bible focused on justice and poverty. A lot of people don't realize that, but we have a God that is very interested in justice for the oppressed. I love this verse here, Isaiah chapter 58, verses 6 through 7. He's talking about fasting. Is this not the kind of fasting I've chose? So God's talking about, if you want to honor me, if you want to give up something for me, what does he instruct us to do? He tells us to loose the chains of injustice, to take the yokes off of the people. He says, is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter when you see the naked to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? So God has a very clear call for us. He's got over 2,000 verses about it, that we have a job to do in caring for other people. And he also gives us a promise of restoration for them. Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 through 4. I love this. He's talking about, binding up the brokenhearted, proclaiming the good news to the poor, proclaiming the good news to those who have grieved. And this is what I really like, is the results of that. So he says that we are anointed to proclaim the good news, but then he says, for those that we are proclaiming it to, for those that have been abused, for those that have been oppressed, he says they will be called the oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. So I think about this, and I feel like I've seen a small glimpse of it with the women and the children that have lived in our homes, how they have went on to redefine what a family is and what their family home will be. If their parents, the grandparents, are using drugs or using alcohol, they will say, no, this isn't going to happen around my children, and they will set their boundary. If their boyfriend, the father of their child, if their husband has relapsed and is back on drugs or alcohol, or is abusing, being violent, they say, no, you can't live here anymore. They have set the boundary. They have redefined what a family home will be in their family line, in their generation, and they are changing their lives, and they are changing the lives of their children. They are doing what was never done for them before. And these verses give me the encouragement and the vision that they will be the ones. I mean, look at what they have survived. You guys didn't have the dreams that I had, and you haven't heard all the stories that they have experienced. But they have survived. I feel Satan throwing the wrath of hell at them in their life. Most of us would have died from it. And they have survived it. They have overcome it. And they have chosen to learn a new way to live. And they have decided that their children will have a different future than what they have had. They are oaks of righteousness, in my opinion. They have survived this, and they have decided that it will be different, and they are changing their generation. They are capable of changing the world more so than any of us. God also gives us a promise of power for us and for them. God says, very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. So we have God's call for justice, we have the promise of restoration, and we have a promise of power and results for us also. So we have a lot of potential for change, and I don't think that we see that. We underestimate it. I looked up how many Christians are there in America. So 75% of Americans identify themselves as Christian. This is in 2015. In 2015, that gives us 241 million Christians in America. That's a lot of Christians. The nice thing is that actually starts to make some of these problem numbers look small. So we've got 21.5 million addicts, 8 million children living with addicts, 10 million children living with domestic violence, 2.8 million runaways. That totals about 41, 42 million. Right? You look at that in comparison with 240 million Christians that we have. All of us have a call from God. All of us have a promise of restoration, and all of us have access to the power of God. And there's only 41 million addicts, children, and runaways. What's holding us back? We can do this. Anything that tells us that we can't is a lie from the enemy. So my question, out to you guys and out to America really, is why don't we have more Christian homes willing to take in survivors than we do pimps willing to exploit them? Now, I already told you guys I've mentored well over 100 women and children, which has been impactful, and it's great. But what if every one of us, what if every Christian decided to dedicate themselves to one survivor of abuse, whether it be trafficking, whether it be domestic violence, whether it be somebody recovering from addictions, any of those things, sexual assault? What if we committed ourselves to love and walk beside that person so that they become a fighter with us in this? So we've got thousands that we haven't reached yet, but it's completely possible to reach them. There's no reason why we can't. So I want to talk about your action plan and what can you do and how can you make a difference in your community, in your family, in what you see, because everybody can make a difference. Number one, you can pursue healing. Healthy individuals make healthy relationships, and that's what makes a healthy community. And when we've got a healthy community, or we've got a healthy family, or we've got a small group of healthy individuals that have dedicated themselves, they can make a huge impact on others. One of the tools that we use to help ourselves get healthy is called Mending the Soul. It's a book and a workbook. We go through it as a small group, and it takes a look at sin in the world and how it's affected us. And we look honestly at how we have impacted others by our own sin and how we have been impacted by sin. We take an honest look at that, and we look to God for healing, and we look to work with each other in relationship to get further in our healing. Because abuse always happens in the context of relationships. Abuse requires another person. And really true healing is going to require another person. We have to work on those relationships and those interactions with people. It's not just getting healed between us and God. We've got to work on that healing and that belief structure that we have about the people around us. So Mending the Soul is a tool that we use, and I would recommend that. I'd also recommend that you get involved. Pay attention to your gut feelings. Take a second look. Take a notice of what's going on. If you're seeing a situation or a kid that you're concerned about, you're not sure how they're doing. If you see a parent that you think might be struggling with addiction, with depression, with an abusive or controlling partner, take notice of that. And it doesn't mean that you have to, you don't have to jump in and play police, but jump in and get involved and start a relationship, start a conversation. You can learn a lot from individuals. People just need support and encouragement to do the right thing. Children need to know that if they can't count on their parents, that they can count on somebody else. And it'd be better and safer for them to count on you as a safe individual than from a predator or a pimp to come up and feed them the lie that says that they could count on them. So take notice, start the conversation, and invite others over. Invite your neighbors over for a barbecue in the yard. Invite them out to dinner, invite them over here for a dinner for potluck. Invite the kids to VBS, offer to give the kids a ride to VBS. Whatever it takes, like get involved, invite them to meals and activities. It's a huge benefit. Huge way to build relationship and get to know people. And then number 3, bet on a miracle. It's not just us doing it by ourselves. God's the one that does the work. And I bet on him coming through supernaturally for him. There's a lot of times where I have no idea what to do. But God does, and he's bigger than me. And so I just encourage you to bet on a miracle. Believe in God's promises. His promises are for you. They're not for somebody else. They're for you too. And you can take hold of that and take faith and confidence in that. I think it was supernatural how he spoke to me in dreams. All of us have dreams. We're all capable of having dreams. We're all capable of hearing from him. So don't think that God can't move supernaturally in your life or give you direction, words or encouragement to say to somebody else. And you can start practicing. We have a book that's actually for practicing. My pastor wrote it. It's called Miracle Work. It's a lot of the stories actually of the beginning of this ministry. And he tells a story of something that we tried and God showed up and it worked. And then he gives a few little action steps on how can you do this, how can you practice this, how can you implement it into your life. It's called Miracle Work. And if you want to connect more with me or connect more about the ministry, we have a Facebook page. It's called BWM Justice. So that's Blue Water Mission Justice. That's the name of our page on Facebook. I do a live video on there about once a week, just educating people, bringing more awareness about the issue of trafficking and the needs and how to get involved. And then I also have an updated prayer list there, a little link where you can sign up on that and I can email out updates. But I know this is a heavy topic, and I hope you guys don't feel overwhelmed by the hard things in this world and the abuse happening in this world, but I hope that you feel encouraged by the reality that we have 241 million Christians in this country. we are certainly capable of utilizing the promises of God, the power of God, and the restoration that He has available to empower a whole new generation to rebuild these cities, to rebuild this world, to rebuild these towns, and rebuild these families. There's an impact that you can make. Don't ever write yourself off on it, and don't write off anybody else.